Modern people flee into their private rooms, into spaces where they imagine they can finally work on themselves without interference from the chaos of other human beings. They seek silence, isolation, and long hours alone with their thoughts. They believe this withdrawal will bring them closer to the awakening they seek. What they usually miss is that solitude becomes a sophisticated form of sleep, a comfortable prison where all their delusions remain unchallenged and intact. Yet there exists another kind of aloneness, one that serves development rather than preventing it. The difference between these two states determines whether your time in solitude awakens you or deepens the hypnotic dream. Most people cannot distinguish between them because they have never examined their motives honestly, never questioned what they are actually seeking when they close the door and sit by themselves. So in this episode, Gurdjieff will help you distinguish these two fundamental states of solitude that every intellectual, every deep thinker, and every seeker goes through in their lives. So stay with us till the end, and if these ideas make sense to you, consider subscribing to this channel for more wisdom audiobooks. When you are truly alone, who observes you? Your own mind watches itself, and this creates a closed circuit where observation and the observed are the same mechanism. You see only what you want to see. You interpret your actions through filters you cannot perceive because those filters are part of the very consciousness attempting to examine them. A man came to my group once who had spent 3 years in isolated meditation practice. He arrived convinced of his considerable development, speaking of the deep insights he had achieved, the clarity he had gained, the distance he had put between himself and his former mechanical nature. Within 2 days of working alongside others, every illusion he had constructed about himself began crumbling. His irritation at minor inconveniences revealed itself immediately. His inability to perform simple physical tasks without inner complaint became obvious. His condescension toward people he judged less developed than himself showed itself in every interaction. The work of self-study can proceed only in properly organized groups. One man alone cannot see himself. When a certain number of people unite together for this purpose, they will, even involuntarily, help one another. It is a common characteristic of human nature that a man sees the faults of others more easily than he sees his own. At the same time, on the path of self-study, he learns that he himself possesses all the faults that he finds in others. Many things that he does not see in himself become visible in other people, and through this recognition he can begin to see them in his own being. This is why I insisted on group work. A man is unable to keep watch on the whole of himself. A man is much too lazy. He will do a great deal without the proper intensity, or he will do nothing at all while thinking that he is doing something. There exists, however, a kind of chosen solitude that serves the work differently. After you have been with others, after you have received impressions of yourself through their reactions, after you have been shown aspects of your mechanical nature that you could never see alone, you may require time by yourself to digest these experiences, to allow them to settle into understanding rather than remaining surface observations. This voluntary solitude has specific qualities that distinguish it from isolation. It is temporary, limited, and taken with a clear purpose. You go into it carrying material from your interactions with others, questions about what you observed in yourself, contradictions that need to be examined without the distraction of new impressions constantly arriving. This time alone is like chewing food after it has entered your mouth. The food came from outside. The chewing you must do yourself. When I took students to my country house in Finland or gathered them at Escapist in the Caucasus Mountains, we worked together intensely, creating friction through our proximity, through the demands of shared tasks, through the necessity of coordinating with personalities, very different from our own. Then, at certain times, I would send people into solitude, give them tasks to complete alone, and create conditions where they could observe themselves without the immediate presence of the group. Yet this solitude always remained connected to the work. It was not an escape from difficulty. It was a matter of difficulty. It was not a withdrawal from challenge. It was a contemplation of the challenge after having faced it. The person who went into this voluntary aloneness carried with them fresh impressions of their own mechanicalness that had been revealed through interaction, and these impressions could be examined in quiet, without the person simply creating new theories about themselves that bore no relation to reality. Observe the person who seeks isolation as refuge from the difficulties of living alongside others. They claim they need quiet to meditate, peace to reflect, solitude to find themselves. What they actually seek is escape from the pressure that only other people can provide, escape from having their illusions challenged, escape from the uncomfortable recognition of how mechanical and contradictory their inner life actually is. In isolation, you can maintain any image of yourself you wish. You can believe yourself patient when you have simply removed all sources of impatience. You can imagine yourself compassionate when you have created conditions that never test whether compassion actually exists in you. You can fancy yourself conscious when the only measure is your own subjective assessment, never verified against the objective observations of people who see you from outside your internal narrative. I have watched people spend years in isolated practice, accumulating knowledge, developing elaborate philosophies, believing themselves to be progressing on the path. Then life demands that they engage with others, that they work alongside people with different ideas, that they participate in activities requiring coordination and cooperation. Immediately, all their supposed development reveals itself as imaginary. The patience they cultivated in solitude vanishes at the first frustration. The love they felt toward all beings disappears when confronted with an actual person who disagrees with them or challenges their assumptions. This isolation weakens presence and energy because it removes the friction necessary for consciousness to develop. When you are alone with your thoughts, you can drift endlessly in imagination, in planning, in theories about yourself and your life, in memories that you reconstruct according to your current mood. Nothing stops this mechanical flow. Nothing creates the shock that could interrupt the dream. You simply continue sleeping while believing yourself more awake than the people you have withdrawn from. Working with others creates what I call conscious suffering. You encounter people whose rhythms differ from yours, whose values contradict yours, whose very presence irritates something in you. This irritation is material for work, not a reason for escape. When you observe yourself becoming impatient with someone's slow pace, you're seeing your own mechanicalness, your inability to adapt, your insistence that reality conform to your preferences. At the Prieuré, my institute outside Paris, I deliberately created conditions that would produce such friction. People from different countries and cultures lived together in close quarters. Tasks required cooperation between individuals who would never have chosen each other as companions. I would sometimes give contradictory instructions to different people, creating situations where conflict was inevitable. Those who could use these situations for self-observation benefited immensely. Those who could only complain about the difficulty missed the entire point of why they were there. The presence of the other is a constant reminder to pay attention, a help to escape, for a moment, from habitual automatic reactions. When you are alone, there is no such reminder. You can sink into your habitual inner state for hours without anything interrupting the pattern. With others present, requiring your attention, demanding response, You are pulled repeatedly out of your internal dreams into something resembling actual presence. Yet I must emphasize this. The work with others only functions when approached consciously. Simply being in a group, simply living alongside others, accomplishes nothing by itself. Millions of people work together, live together, spend their entire lives in proximity to other humans, and it produces no development whatsoever. They remain as mechanical as the person living in isolation, perhaps more so because they never even notice their mechanicalness, never have a moment to observe themselves because their attention is continuously scattered among external demands. The difference between voluntary solitude and escapist isolation can also be recognized by examining the structure surrounding the time alone. Voluntary solitude occurs within a larger framework of discipline, of regular work with others, of accountability to something beyond personal whim. You know when the solitude will end. You know what you are meant to accomplish during this time. You return afterward to the group with observations to be tested against shared reality. Escapist isolation has no such structure. It extends indefinitely according to mood and convenience. There is no clear purpose beyond the vague feeling that being alone is somehow spiritual. There is no accountability. No one challenges your assessment of your own progress. You can remain in this state for years, convinced that you are developing while actually becoming more rigid, more identified with your limited perspective, more unable to participate genuinely in the world of other humans. I insisted on specific practices, on defined periods for different activities, and on regular meetings where people were required to report their observations. This structure prevented the comfortable drift into imagination that destroys all real work. When you must show up at a specific time, ready to participate in group activities, whether you feel like it or not, you encounter yourself as you actually are, rather than as you imagine yourself to be. The person in isolation can always postpone the difficult work until tomorrow, can always find reasons why today is not the right time to make an effort. With others depending on you, with tasks that cannot be delayed without affecting the entire group, this excuse becomes impossible. You must work whether your emotional center wants to or not, whether your intellectual center has created some theory about why conditions are not optimal. Here is a simple test for determining whether your time alone serves development or prevents it. After spending time in solitude, do you emerge more capable of working with others, more patient with their difficulties, more able to see your own mechanical nature in their behavior? Or do you emerge feeling superior to others, irritated by their lack of understanding, convinced that your insights during isolation have elevated you beyond their level? The person who has used solitude correctly returns to group work refreshed, carrying genuine observations about themselves that others can verify, ready to engage more deeply with the difficulties of coordinating with different personalities. The person who has merely isolated themselves returns feeling special, separate, and unable to work effectively because they have spent their time constructing elaborate mental structures that have no connection to reality. 20 people working together will have 20 times as much material from self-observation as one person working alone. Each person's observations become available to the others. When you see someone struggling with impatience, you recognize your own impatience more clearly. When you witness someone lost in imagination about their abilities, you can observe the same process in yourself. This multiplication of material accelerates development in ways that solitary work simply cannot match. Yet always remember, it is not the quantity of impressions that matters, but what you do with them. A person can spend years in group work, participating in all activities, following all instructions, and develop nothing because they never truly observe themselves. They remain mechanical, going through motions, collecting experiences like tourists gathering photographs, never allowing what they observe to penetrate to the core of their being. What I teach is neither retreat into isolation nor mechanical social life. It is conscious participation in the world, including conscious work alongside others who share your aim, combined with periods of solitude used for specific purposes of digestion and self-examination. The balance between these two states must be maintained according to where you are in your development and what the work currently requires. A beginner needs more time with others because they have not yet learned to observe themselves accurately. Everything they see when alone is filtered through imagination and false estimates of their capabilities. Only through repeated interactions that expose their mechanicalness can they begin to gather real material for observation. Someone further along the path may require more solitude because they have accumulated material that needs to be integrated, understood, and connected to previous observations. Yet this person still requires regular engagement with others to prevent the isolation from becoming an escape, to test whether what they understood during solitude actually functions when applied in real situations involving other people. Even when physically alone, you can maintain a connection to the work through remembering those you work with, through considering what you owe them for their help in revealing yourself to yourself, and through recognizing that your development is linked to theirs. This attitude transforms solitude from isolation into a different form of participation in a shared aim. Everything I have said reduces to this. Examine honestly why you seek time alone. Are you moving towards something or away from something? Are you seeking to digest genuine material gathered through interaction, or are you seeking escape from the difficulty of having your illusions challenged? Are you using solitude as a tool that serves work with others, or as a hiding place where you can maintain comfortable fantasies about your own development? The answers to these questions cannot be theoretical. You must look at actual results. After spending time alone, are you more capable or less capable of working effectively with others? Has your understanding deepened in ways that can be verified through changed behavior, or have you simply accumulated more ideas that have no connection to how you actually function? Has the solitude strengthened your presence and energy, or has it weakened them through disconnection from the friction that forces consciousness to remain active? One cannot attain mastery of oneself by confining oneself within the confines of solitude. This is a fact, not an opinion. You can test it through your own experience. The person who isolates themselves, believing they are working on themselves, will discover, if they are honest, that years have passed with no real change in their essential being. The person who engages with others, using solitude only as digestion of the material that engagement provides, will discover development that can be measured not by subjective feeling, but by actual capacity to function consciously in increasingly difficult circumstances. Your development depends on the friction provided by others who show you yourself as you actually are, rather than as you imagine yourself to be. Solitude serves only when it digests material gathered through this friction, transforming observation into understanding that can be applied when you return to engagement with the world.